You mentioned that the definition changes slightly each semester for the, kind of core term of the course. When students take part in the activities, how do you make sure that the definition of the literature and culture doesn't stray too far? Is there a border in your mind somewhere, I guess, is what I would add to the way that she's phrased the question, or is the whole point to have it, shift?
Well, I can say my answer. I won't say that it's the answer, but in my preference, I like it to be as muddy as possible, because I don't want the question to be answered by the time the class is over. I want the question to be ongoing. I want students to have seen enough things that keep them going. I still have more to learn about this. I have still more questions to ask. And so, but what I do, if I feel like it's mostly male voices or mostly rural, I'm very aware of that. So I do deliberately diversify region, time, place, gender, and attitudes about certain things, attitudes about immigration, attitudes about assimilation. Like, I deliberately make that messy, because if they start to think, well, all Mexican American authors feel this way about assimilation, well, I show them an author who feels very differently, right? And so, because they know that already. They know that from hearing their parents disagree about those issues, or themselves disagree with their parents about those issues. And so when you can bring in voices that just complicate it, I think for me, it's been more powerful of an approach. Again, it shifts the expertise and the know-it-all, even from the authors themselves. The authors are making a point, but this other author is coming from a different direction and trying to make their case. So that's my answer for my preference. The muddier the better.
Super answer. Mary has a kind of related question, Mary Coleman. She says, do you recommend a resource for looking at terminology? And she follows up with a little bit of context. In our politically correct world, that is one point that I'd like to be well educated on. So what resources might you recommend for focusing on all these terms?
Yeah, there's probably 5 books that I can share on, as far as depending on what you're hoping to look for, that I will share. I think one place to start, not so much with the terminology, because a lot of that's to find people navigating that, or a lot of scholars write about it. But one thing that I have found I do a lot of work on is there's a lot of allusions that occur in Mexican American literature that, unless we lived it, we don't recognize it immediately. And so there's a book, I want to make sure I get the title right. I think it's called Chicano Folklore. And it's basically just terms to find what, like, curanderismo is. Let's say that you don't know what that is. I guarantee if you're reading Mexican American literature, you see it. And so having that as a resource for those kind of terms, I think is a good place to start. And then I'll share some other resources for terms. But I would say, even without those books, I think knowing what the different terms mean to different groups, and why some groups have issues with some of those terms, and having a conversation and letting students have a conversation, that's the respectful. It's respecting where the other side's coming from, and so it's less about politically correct, and recognizing, well, that student chooses that term, and this is why, and I'm going to respect that choice, and that is the right way to be. It's not about necessarily the right term, even though I may not agree that that's the term I would use. And we have that conversation, say, I choose this term instead. But no one, I think the way we handle it, no one feels less than or feels excluded. And some of them even change their mind after time.
Yeah, that's fabulous. We've had this question before earlier in the week, just more generally about resources for key terms. So I just wanted to share the keywords for American Culture Studies is one of those texts that might be handy for you guys to have as a resource. And even handier, a bunch of terms that were in the first edition for this are now available for free online. So if you just Google the text, and it's edited by Bruce Burgett and Glenn Hendler, that's a place to go to kind of get some of these various definitions for the various subfields we've been working in your own mind, at least where they are for some scholars. And I would just second Andres in saying all of these terms are fluid. You know, it's not like you're ever going to pin one down and have it stably stay there. Just like if we look up a word in the OED, right, we'll see that it's changed, you know, over the years, and that often it's debatable.
Yeah, a great example is the X, the like Chicanx, Latinx. There's a debate about that term, right? And within the community. And I think rather than having the answer, I think exploring the debate allows the student to kind of ask themselves where they fall on that and move forward from there.
That's such a great example. And we're seeing the same thing in Native studies, right? Do we want to say American Indian? Do we want to say Indian? Do we want to say Native? Do we want to say Indigenous? We're talking Canadian. We want to say maybe First Nations, but it partly depends. And it also depends on the time period that you're engaging with, you know, because in the 19th century, terms were used differently in texts that the students might read, right? So all of that's, you know, that's part of the discussion and the richness of the discussion. And I love the way you've underscored that for us, Andres. All right, I think we have time for one more question. Dr. Mullis submitted one that several folks have given a thumbs up to. He says, you discussed how having materials that interest or that the students can relate to has increased the engagement of your students. Have you seen that engagement continue into other literature beyond the elective class? In other words, you pointed out that the engagement of the young man explaining the painting to his mom. I realized that this class was probably the only Hispanic literature course that he took, but did you do any follow-up to see if students have taken the course, who've taken your course, then have carried over that interest into the study of other texts?
Yeah, I have seen. Yeah, I have seen a lot. I have seen that. Again, it's something I think a lot of the people watching right now, and including myself, know that we're kind of, you know, we're going through school and we're kind of doing what we need to do, and then we get something awakens something in us that we didn't know was there, and it shifts us. It shifts our approach to learning forever. It awakens a desire to ask questions, and what we learn to do is we learn to see it even when it's not necessarily there. So what I found was, to your question, is there'd be a lot of students that they'd be learning something that was not about Mexican American identity at all, like literally or inherently about it, but they would see something there that even the teacher didn't see, and they'd say, I want to approach it this way. I have this new lens, and I want to approach it from this perspective, or I want to pair this with this, or I want to know if I can do this. And it started making its way into their forensics classes, into their history classes, into their psychology classes. And because they now saw that expertise was not just in the book and not just in the classroom, they also saw that their ideas, their opinions, their insight mattered. And they also saw that there were a lot of people like them that had a lot to say that normally wouldn't have been recognized. And so they now see that they have a space, and some of them recognize a responsibility to engage, to speak up, to ask questions, and they've learned to do it well. And they've learned that you can do it well and respectfully. And I've seen them, and they push. And yeah, you'll see them engage with, like, a lot of my students, I have them as juniors, and then the very next year they're in a class that's like normally British literature, and they're finding ways to find things that are in common, but then also pushing and challenging. And I think that makes it more interesting. Like, one of the best things is to be against whatever you're learning, right? And so it's okay to be like, yeah, this British literature class is leaving out a lot of important ideas. But guess what? You're engaged in a way that you weren't before, because you see something that you didn't see before. You're not just sitting there as a receptacle, taking in information. And so, yeah, I would say that I've seen, and I've seen it in Francisco, but I've seen a lot of students that were not really sure they were going to go to college, and then go into, I'm going to go and I want to figure out a way to be this for students. I want you to be a teacher or an English major, or, you know, somehow be an agent for this type of awakening for people in the future. So it's been interesting. It's been interesting to see where students get really fired up about it, where they end up going afterwards.
That's super inspiring. Thank you so much. Marissa, do we have time for one more, or should we break now and then save some of these?
We definitely have time for one more. And actually there's a question by Zachary Wilson in the Q&A box that I think would be a good one to end on.
All right, Zachary says, I've learned a lot about MUS in the past 3 years, but I'm still a little nervous to teach it. as a year-long course at a non-Hispanic Black teacher. I think most students deserve a Latinx teacher, ideally, and yeah, but I'm glad he's asking this question because I'm a white person, right? And I'm trying to do a lot of this work. So advice, he says, on how to increase student ownership in the course beyond the first project idea. This is their identity and culture. They should be in the driver's seat. Zachary, what a fabulous question.
Yeah, so I think one, I've told teachers who've asked that same question, own it right away. Like that's you're gonna handle it from a place of respect because you're aware that there's some, that they might, and that you recognize that they're gonna bring some insight and experience that you may not know and that you're gonna count on them for that. They like being positioned that way. I think you're right also to if at your campus there is someone who could do it well that is Latino, Latina, Latinx, you want to fight for that. However, if you're the only one who can do it and you're the one who has a chance to do it, don't let your ethnicity keep that class from existing. Just what I would say, partner as much as possible. I tell you what, most of those guest speakers I brought in, I'm Mexican-American, but I brought in a lot of guest speakers because I had imposter syndrome. I was worried all year that I wasn't the most qualified person to be teaching this class. So I would say supplement that. I bring in a lot of women to speak because I'm worried that I have too much of a male-centered approach. So I think having that, recognizing that and branching out and opening the space should help with that. I think your attitude, your idea of positioning the students at the center. What is it? And then my second project is why does it matter? And it can be why does it matter to you? Why should it matter to someone who isn't Mexican American, that maybe make a case that everyone should take this class? So we shift to that conversation, like why does this need to room in the classroom? And again, that taps into, now they understand it. Now they're trying to, like I'm doing, carve space for this to exist in more places. And I think that second project works really well for that.
What an inspiring and affirming answer. Thank you so much. Great to hear. I think Marissa's going to shut us down for a bit, for a break now.